Emily sat by the large bay window in the living room, watching the last traces of the autumn sunset melt into the horizon. The room was quiet, aside from the faint hum of the dishwasher. It had been weeks since she and Mark had sat down together for dinner. He was always away, traveling for work, and when he did come home, he was too tired to engage in meaningful conversation. Emily felt the weight of their strained marriage in every silent evening. Sophie, their 7-year-old daughter, was playing on the floor with her dolls, oblivious to the growing distance between her parents. Emily sighed, turning her attention to the framed family photo on the mantel. In the picture, they were smiling Emily, Mark, and Sophie, taken just 2 years ago on a family vacation. But now, that happiness felt like a distant memory. Mark's job as a regional sales manager kept him on the road for most of the month. His absence had started as an inconvenience, but had slowly evolved into a chasm between them. Emily tried to be understanding. He was providing for them, after all. But the loneliness she felt gnawed at her, and she had no one to talk to about it, except David. David was a colleague at the marketing firm where Emily worked. He was charming, attentive, and always knew how to make her laugh. They'd become friends over the past year, and Emily found herself confiding in him more and more. At first, it was innocent, just two coworkers sharing their frustrations over lunch. But over time, their conversations grew more personal, and Emily began to look forward to her time with David in a way that made her feel conflicted. As she sat in the darkening room, Emily's phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a message from David. "Hope you're doing okay. Tough day." She hesitated for a moment before typing back, "Yeah, just the usual. Mark's still not home." Her heart fluttered as she sent the message. It wasn't right, and she knew it. But at least David cared enough to ask how she was feeling. Mark hadn't done that in months. She glanced over at Sophie, who was still engrossed in her play, completely unaware of her mother's inner turmoil. Later that night, after Sophie was tucked into bed, Emily found herself thinking more and more about her marriage. She and Mark hadn't had a real conversation in weeks, and when they did talk, it was only about logistics, Sophie's school, the grocery list, bills. Where had the intimacy gone? She wasn't sure if Mark had noticed the growing gap between them, or if he simply didn't care. Emily's phone buzzed again. This time, it was Mark, sending a quick text to let her know he'd landed in Dallas for his next business trip. She stared at the screen for a moment, feeling the sting of disappointment. "No, I miss you. No, I love you." Just a sterile update. She set the phone down and let the quiet of the house settle around her. The emotional distance between her and Mark was undeniable, and she had no idea how to bridge it. Emily stood at the kitchen counter the next morning, stirring her coffee absently as Sophie ate her breakfast at the table. The house felt empty without Mark, even though she had grown used to his absences. As she watched Sophie chatter happily about her day at school, Emily smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Sophie was the only thing that still brought light into Emily's life. At work, things were different. David had become a constant in Emily's life, a friendly face, a listening ear. He had a way of making her feel seen, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Every day, they'd have lunch together, sharing stories and jokes. It was harmless, Emily told herself. They were just friends. But there were moments when she caught herself staring at him a little too long, wondering what it would be like if things were different. That day, as they sat together at a small cafe near the office, David leaned in closer. "You've been quiet today. Everything okay?" he asked, his blue eyes full of concern. Emily hesitated. She wanted to brush off his question, but the truth weighed heavily on her. "It's just Mark. He's never home anymore. I feel like we're drifting apart," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded, his expression serious. "I'm sorry, Emily. You deserve better than that. You deserve someone who's there for you." The warmth in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. She wasn't used to this, someone caring so deeply about her feelings. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to be with someone like David, someone who would be present, who would listen. But then the guilt hit her hard. Mark was her husband. They had a family together. She couldn't let herself fall into this trap. "I don't know what to do," Emily admitted. Her eyes welling up with tears, she quickly blinked away. David reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. You don't have to figure it out alone, Emily. I'm here for you, whatever you need. Emily pulled her hand back, the contact too much for her to handle. She couldn't cross that line. Not yet. Thanks, David. But I should probably head back to the office, she said, forcing a smile as she stood up. As she walked back to work, Emily's mind raced. She was playing with fire and she knew it. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like someone truly cared about her. Still, the guilt gnawed at her. What would happen if Mark found out? What would happen to Sophie? The thought of breaking up their family terrified her. That evening, as Emily and Sophie sat on the couch watching TV, Sophie turned to her with wide, innocent eyes. Mom, why don't we all watch TV together anymore? You, me, and Dad, she asked. Emily's heart sank. How could she explain to a 7-year-old that her father was always away, that their family was falling apart? Dad's busy with work, sweetie. But we'll all spend time together soon, I promise, she said, forcing a smile. But deep down, Emily wasn't sure she believed her own words. The night of the office event arrived, and Emily found herself dressing up with more care than usual. She knew David would be there, and despite her inner turmoil, she couldn't deny the excitement bubbling within her. She told herself it was just a work function, nothing more. But deep down, she knew tonight would test her in ways she wasn't ready for. The evening was filled with chatter and laughter as colleagues mingled over drinks. David found Emily quickly, his presence like a magnet she couldn't resist. They spent most of the evening together, their conversations flowing effortlessly, as always. But tonight, there was a different energy between them, an unspoken tension that neither of them acknowledged, but both felt. As the night wore on, Emily and David found themselves alone on the rooftop terrace, the city lights twinkling around them. The air was crisp, and Emily wrapped her arms around herself to keep warm. David, noticing her shiver, draped his jacket over her shoulders. Thanks, Emily murmured, feeling the weight of his jacket and his gaze. They stood in silence for a moment, the city bustling below them, but up here, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. Emily, David began, his voice soft but intense. I know I shouldn't say this, but I can't stop thinking about you. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She had known this was coming. She'd felt it building for weeks. But hearing the words out loud made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. David, we can't, she started, but her words trailed off as he took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. I know, he said, his voice barely a whisper now. But I can't help how I feel. And I think you feel the same. Emily's mind raced. She knew this was wrong. She was married. She had a family. But in that moment, with David standing so close, she didn't feel married. She didn't feel like a wife or a mother. She felt like a woman, desired and wanted in a way she hadn't felt in years. David reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. You don't have to say anything, he murmured, leaning in. Their faces were inches apart, and for a brief moment, Emily let herself imagine what it would be like to give in, to kiss him, to let go of all the guilt and doubt. But just as quickly, reality crashed back in. No, she whispered, stepping back. I can't do this. David's expression softened, and he nodded, stepping back as well. I understand, he said quietly. I had to tell you how I feel. Emily felt a mixture of relief and sadness as she returned his jacket. She knew she had made the right decision, but part of her couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if she hadn't. As she left the party that night, Emily's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She had come so close to crossing a line she could never uncross. And yet, Emily spent the next few days in a fog, replaying the rooftop moment with David over and over in her mind. She had come so close to crossing a line that would have changed everything, and the weight of that decision pressed on her chest like a heavy stone. Every time she looked at Sophie, or spoke to Mark on the phone, the guilt twisted in her gut. She knew she had to confront what had happened, or almost happened, but she wasn't ready for the consequences. Mark returned home from his trip late one evening, carrying his suitcase into the quiet house. Sophie was already in bed, and Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the cup of tea in front of her. When she heard the front door creak open, she stood up, her heart racing. She could feel the tension between them as Mark walked into the room, exhausted but clearly relieved to be home. "Hey," he said, giving her a tired smile as he set his suitcase by the door. "Long week." "Yeah," Emily replied softly, not sure what else to say. She wanted to rush into his arms, to feel the warmth of their old connection, but something held her back. They hadn't really talked in so long. She wasn't sure how to bridge the gap anymore. Mark walked over and kissed her on the cheek, his touch brief and almost absent-minded. "How is Sophie? Everything okay while I was gone?" Emily nodded, her throat tightening.
"She's fine."
"She missed you, though." Mark sighed, rubbing his eyes. "I missed her too. I missed both of you." Something in his words struck Emily like a hammer. It was the first time in months that Mark had acknowledged how distant they had become. She sat back down at the table, her hands trembling slightly as she took a deep breath. "We need to talk, Mark," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark frowned, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. "About what?" Emily stared down at her hands, twisting the silver band of her wedding ring nervously. She didn't know where to start, but she knew she couldn't avoid the conversation any longer. "About us. About our marriage." Mark leaned back in his chair, a weary expression settling on his face. "Yeah, I know things haven't been great lately, but I'm doing my best, Emily. I'm working hard to provide for us." "I know you are," Emily said quickly, feeling a rush of guilt. "But it's not just about that, Mark. You're always gone. We barely see you, and when you are home, it's like we're strangers." Mark's face softened, the defensiveness draining out of him. "I know I haven't been around as much as I should. I've been so focused on work, on making sure we're financially secure, that I guess I've taken you for granted." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. This was the opening she had been waiting for, but it didn't make what she had to say any easier. She looked him in the eye, her voice trembling as she spoke. "While you were gone, I've been spending time with someone at work. David." Mark's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. "What do you mean, spending time with him?" Emily took a deep breath, her heart aching as she forced herself to be honest. "We've gotten close. Too close. I've been talking to him about things I should have been talking to you about. And the other night, after the office event, we almost kissed." The silence that followed was suffocating. Mark sat there, staring at her, his expression unreadable. Emily felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She wanted to reach out to him, to explain that nothing had really happened, but she knew that wasn't the point. The damage had already been done. "I stopped it before anything happened," Emily continued, her voice shaky. "But I came so close, Mark, and it made me realize how far apart we've drifted. I didn't even know how lonely I was until—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Mark leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. His face was pale, and his eyes were full of pain, but there was no anger in his voice when he finally spoke. "Why didn't you tell me how you were feeling?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "Why didn't you talk to me instead of him?" Emily wiped a tear from her cheek, her voice breaking. "Because you were never here, Mark. And when you were, it felt like you didn't see me anymore. I felt invisible. And David, he made me feel like I mattered again. But I don't want that. I want us. I want our family back." Mark was silent for a long time, staring down at his hands as if he were trying to piece together everything she had just said. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a sadness that tore at Emily's heart. "I never wanted to hurt you," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been so caught up in work that I forgot what really matters. You, Sophie, yes. I should have been here. I should have been paying attention." Emily reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his. For the first time in a long time, she felt like they were really connecting, like they were finally facing the truth of their relationship. "I'm sorry, Mark," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you either. I love you. I love our family. But we can't keep pretending that everything's fine when it's not." Mark squeezed her hand, his eyes locking with hers. "I love you too, Emily. And I want to fix this. I don't know how yet, but I know I don't want to lose you. We can figure this out, together." Tears streamed down Emily's face as she nodded, relief washing over her. They both had a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, they were facing it together. Just then, Sophie's soft voice drifted from the hallway. "Mom?
Dad."
They both turned to see their daughter standing there, her sleepy eyes blinking at them. Emily quickly wiped her tears and smiled at her. "What is it, sweetheart?" Sophie rubbed her eyes and shuffled over to them. "Why are you guys up? It's late." Mark smiled and stood up, lifting Sophie into his arms. "We're just talking, kiddo. Everything's okay." Sophie looked between her parents, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Can we watch a movie tomorrow? All three of us, like we used to?" Emily's heart swelled as she glanced at Mark, who nodded. "Yeah, we can do that," he said softly. "I'll make sure we have time." Sophie grinned and rested her head on her father's shoulder, satisfied with the answer. As Mark carried her back to bed, Emily watched them disappear down the hallway, her heart full of hope. It wasn't going to be easy, but they were going to fight for their family. They were going to find their way back to each other.